Well, hello everybody. Thanks for joining. Just to let you know, I'll post the dates for the next satsangs in August on the website. I haven't checked the dates, but on the Saturday around the 5th, 6th, or 7th of August, whatever day it lands on, I think that's when the next satsang will be, and then maybe around the 20th or 21st of August, which is 2 Saturdays after that. So feel free to join. Today I wanted to run through the framework, which I sort of veered away from a little bit, presenting as a whole, and I'm not going to present it as a whole today, but there are some very important parts of the framework that, as I said, I veered away from presenting the framework as a whole when I was doing regular weekly satsangs, because it seemed appropriate to sort of dive into subsets of the overall framework. But what I've realized in taking a look at a lot of other content that's out in relation to related topics is that the framework, even though it's not the truth, there's a concept that I often put in which says, whatever is shared is a concept and not the truth. And the reason is that when we're talking about life, but remember, we're talking about life from the perspective of a particular objective, and that's the objective of the seeker. And when the seeker really asks or becomes clear, they have to ask themselves the question, because it's not apparent given the way that our attachments are formed. But when we really ask the question, a seeker is looking for something is driving the seeking. Now, we could frame it as though we're looking for reality or truth or the true self. But if we also want to approach it from a practical point of view, we need to say why. Why are we looking for the true self? And in practice, these realizations that can happen as part of the seeking deliver something very practical. And that is the end of suffering, is one way of putting it. That might sound grandiose. Really, it's happiness for the human being. It's a change in how we experience ourself, and more importantly, our response to being alive. Our sense of self changes, and therefore the way we receive outcomes, or the way we respond to outcomes. And outcomes is a term that covers a lot of different things. It could be a tree branch falling on your car and damaging the car. It could be someone shouting at you, a stranger shouting at you. It could be a situation at work. Outcomes basically means everything that is happening in life. And our relationship and our attitude to the broad range of outcomes that can happen in life is usually not one where we feel at peace and harmonious with life. A lot of things in life tend to be taken by the me as an attack on who I am, and so there's a defense mechanism that kicks in, and that whole movement that is habitual and we don't even give it a second thought usually means that we're in a state of dis-ease, in a state of fight against life. And the theory of Advaita and or the principle of Advaita is that life is a whole, a singularity, that all of the things that are happening from one perspective can be seen as a lot of individual moving parts. The tree is different from the car. One person is different from another person. And so from one perspective, it's me against another. As we zoom out If we can zoom out, we might start to see that everything that takes place in life is taking place within life, and nothing is separate from life. Everything is interdependent with life, and therefore we can say is life itself, or life expresses as a multitude of different objects. And maybe an easy way of looking at that is if you have a petri dish and things start to grow in the petri dish, bacteria or whatever is being set up, and we look at that dish as the universe. Everything that develops is, so there might be 3 different types of bacteria or 3,000 different types of bacteria, but they're really all expressions of that environment, of that system. Nothing is separate from the system. Nothing exists independent of the system. And so the attitude, the view that we have of ourselves, without this deeply ingrained realization, is a view that sees ourselves as separate and independent, not connected to anything, not part of anything. And that's the separation. It's as simple as that. It's a mind, a thinking, perception, or it's a cognition that imagines ourselves different to the reality, or this is why it's called ignorance in the Buddhist philosophy, misunderstanding in Advaita. It is a wrong perception, although perception tends to imply ordinarily how things are just the senses. This includes a cognition, an attitude, a way of seeing life that sees everything as separate and independent. Now, it's completely understandable why this happens, because all of the objects have very, based on the senses, so what we experience, the objects look very different from each other, and they look like there are hard boundaries, and you throw a ball from one place to another and it seems like a separate independent object. And from one perspective it is, right? We have to be practical as well, but the understanding is about being able to see the whole from many different angles. And what we don't tend to have as human beings is this appreciation of the oneness, the non-separateness of life. So even if the senses tell us everything is separate, our thinking needs to maybe go beyond, take us beyond that and say, well, what if the senses can't observe on the level of the oneness? And so obviously the senses are going to tell us one story, and that in large part is why the misunderstanding sets in. Another reason is because the functioning that happens through this particular body-mind, the thinking, and also all of the biological functions, so washing the dishes, speaking, moving one's arms, making a cup of tea, all of that is accompanied by a feeling that this is all of my doing. And so it creates impression that when observed, so throughout our life we have awareness of our, or a sense of how things are happening, and the fact that it feels like I am doing it, I am speaking, I am thinking, further enforces the notion of separate and autonomous, not connected. So this then becomes the basis of what we can refer to as the me, this all of the way that life is experienced sets up a psychological sense of who we are. It's the psychological sense of who we are gets laid down layer upon layer upon layer based on a feedback loop of our experience in life. And we don't see the psychological self being laid down. So an example of what would impact it. So in general terms, we could say that the psychological self is based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning. It is part of what develops in life. Now, our genes and up-to-date conditioning don't only develop our psychological self, they also are the reason why our biological self gets put in place. But if we looked at the up-to-date conditioning, means if we, as a child, get treated a certain way or told that we're good enough or not good enough, then we can imagine how our psychological self might get another layer laid down based on a particular event that happened. And we don't see that laying down of the psychological self happening when it happens. We just know that an event happens, and there could be crying, there could be happiness, whatever the event happens to be, and that puts in place another layer of the psychological self. So by the time we're, I don't know what the age is, it starts forming at around the age of 2, along with language. Not surprisingly, that means when our cognition has developed to a certain degree. So that's when the tantrums start happening. So that's when the ego really starts to be formed. And so, by the time we're 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, the psychological self has had years and years of being built up. And that is the self with a small s. It's our idea of ourself. Now, not an idea that we have created, but rather something that has developed, something that has been laid down, something that unfolds, something that is imposed. And we move through life and respond and have a life experience that we're all familiar with, and that life experience by and large is because of the psychological self. That, according to the wisdom teachings, doesn't understand itself, doesn't understand life. It's ignorant, it's full of ignorance, it's full of misunderstanding. And according to what I'm putting forward and the general principle in Advaita, that base misunderstanding is the misunderstanding that I am separate and independent and autonomous, separate from life, insulated from life, not connected from life. Or not connected to life. So what changes when we start seeking? It doesn't necessarily change straight away when we start seeking, but when the structure really starts to get adjusted, what is it that changes? And this is one of the points I'd like to make today. It's this notion of consciousness. And I'd like to spend some time talking about what consciousness is from the perspective of this framework, meaning with the objective of happiness in life, or the objective of what comes as a result of, let's call it liberation or enlightenment, which really just means this process that seekers find themselves drawn to. Because you can go and listen to philosophers, modern ones, not so modern ones, and scientists, neuroscientists, physicists, and they'll all have a different interpretation of what consciousness is. So you can even now listen to computer scientists working on AI, and they'll have theories of where consciousness comes from, what actually determines or dictates whether something, including a computer, is conscious or not conscious. So I don't think that, well, as far as well, computers aren't conscious yet, and they may never be conscious. It really does depend on what your definition of consciousness is and what it ultimately depends on. And finding out whether consciousness is a emergent property from the brain, or whether consciousness is not biological and comes from outside the biological system. At the end of the day, that's not really so important. It might sound like it's well, isn't that knowledge? Isn't that what we need to know? And actually, no, there's a lot of these things that we don't need to have answers for. In fact, a lot of teachers in history, Buddha in particular, wouldn't answer certain questions. They're the unanswerables. Really, it means you can't have the answer to that question. And frankly, it's not necessary. So this this topic of what is it that I really need to know then? What is it about? Comes back to, what are you really seeking? What is the process of enlightenment really about? And that's why I think it's so important to bring it back to what enlightenment delivers, what you will have after enlightenment that you didn't have before. That's a question we need to ask. In fact, that was a question that Ramesh asked his guru, and he got into a bit of trouble for it. But as far as Ramesh was concerned, it was a completely valid and practical question. Now, as far as I understand it, it was just a family guru that you'd go to as a matter of course. It wasn't a guru that he felt was a guru in the sense that he had a relationship, for example, with Nisargadatta, where that would be considered a true guru for Ramesh. But anyway, he was in a gathering with this guru, and he asked, what will I have after enlightenment that I don't have before? And when he described this, he said he could see the guru getting angry, like, what an impertinent question. You can't ask that sort of question. And Ramesh said the only reason that the guru didn't get very angry was that he saw everyone else in the audience was interested to hear the answer to the question. And so Ramesh said he answered it in a way that you answer a question without giving an answer. And he said, when you're enlightened, you'll know. So Ramesh thought, well, that's not much help to me, because Ramesh wanted to know that question so that it could become the basis of his deductive reasoning as part of the seeking. Let me elaborate on this point a bit further. I've been interested, having come across a documentary, as I mentioned in the last satsang, on the philosophy put forward by Spinoza, and seeing the correlation or the similarity between that and this framework. I started listening to some other content on YouTube, and quite a lot actually in the last week, from different angles: computer science, physics, modern day philosophers, different schools of science. And it became very apparent that most of the people discussing God, consciousness, creation, free will even, seem to be discussing it with the hope of finding knowledge and answers to questions. So they're, in a way, you could say, academic, almost as if they want to be able to, and this isn't a criticism, it was an observation. It's as if they would like to be able to find something that they can then write a textbook on, or an informational guide which says, okay, now this problem has been solved. We now understand another part of how life works. And there's a place, definitely, for understanding more and more aspects of what makes life work. If we didn't understand certain laws of physics, we couldn't build bridges effectively. So we figure out some things and we can do a lot of things with that information. So by all means, more and more things should be understood and will be understood, and books will be written on them. But is it necessary for us as seekers to have the answers to these questions? And what I saw with one presenter who has thousands of podcasts or interviews, or recordings, and a lot of them are with interviews with people, and he goes and around the world and speaks to physicists and anthropologists and linguists, philosophers. And he says he's driven to find out answers to these questions. And in the 10 or 15 videos I saw, what became clear is no one has any answers. Everyone has their position, which is very important for someone to have a position. And most of them realize it's a position, and they say that they don't have anything definitive. And it comes with the territory, really. So at the end of the day, I think a lot of these questions, if you look into them for long enough, you might realize that, it's part of the peace comes when we can surrender to the fact that there isn't an answer available to us, and that we're unlikely to be the one in life that finds it. Because if you listen to the people spending their careers on this, they're very, very intelligent people with amazing, instruments and technology available to them, and they don't have answers. And what really surprised me is that the presenter seems passionate about finding an answer to, let's say, if God exists, or if we have free will, or what consciousness is, where does it come from? But he never once really says why he's interested in this. And I posited, to the point where I actually was so interested, I asked a question on the YouTube channel along the line, saying, why are you so interested in these questions? I can only assume that you're interested in the question because you've concluded that having the answer is going to somehow make your personal life experience better. Better, probably in the way of an internal, an improvement in contentment, satisfaction, let's say, what peace of mind. If it's not that's driving him, then I'd have to conclude that he's really just doing it for entertainment purpose, which has a value. He's decided, well, I've got the resources to be able to do this. I've got the time to do it. It's something that interests me. So I'll spend the next 10 years. It seems like he's already spent 5 years at least, plus the other 25 years of his own interest, but 5 years of producing videos. And so I can conclude that it's just entertainment value. Now, there's value in that. We have to spend our lives doing something, and you might as well do something you enjoy. But if he's just doing it for entertainment value, to pass time in an enjoyable way, then we have to say, well, then it's not really that important. He could be doing gardening instead if he liked gardening. It's just so that he can have. Whereas if we assume that it's in order, where he believes that if he gets answers to these questions, it's going to make his life better or make life in general better, then it becomes a more important quest. But I think that there's a certain configuration and movement of this psychological me that tends to distort the seeking. And that is the assumption that the psychological me feels uneasy, dissatisfied, not content, feels like it doesn't necessarily have purpose or meaning. And we can call that an uncomfortableness. That generally is the human condition to some extent or another. I'm not saying that everyone is in deep depression, not that necessarily uncomfortable, but a range, a spectrum of uncomfortableness, just because the psychological self has been put in place. And there's an automatic assumption that this is because something is missing. That's what it feels like. The uncomfortableness, it sort of gives feedback that unless we've learned to, or at least been coached, given hints about the nature of this uncomfortableness and the fact that it's full of ignorance, and that the feedback it gives is not necessarily giving us the right answer. But the feedback says, I'm missing something, and when I get something, then it will be okay. Then this feeling will go away. Whether it's money, whether it's relationship, appreciation from others, or knowledge. So we might be seeking knowledge, thinking that if I become more intelligent, if I understand more, if I have more knowledge about all sorts of topics, then life might get better. And it might be that very movement that is reinforcing the psychological me. If we keep feeling that and keep believing it and keep moving in that direction, then that may be the very opposite of what the seeking is. When it kicks in a way that starts to be productive, it could be the very opposite of what the real seeking is. So essentially what I mean by that is the real seeking that's actually going to get us somewhere, realizes that is a form of suffering, realizes that is a form of ignorance, realizes that is the form of the psychological self that is attached to outcomes, thinks that its happiness is to be found in the external by gaining things. And once that starts to become part of our working mind, once that concept becomes part of our working mind, that movement is seen in practice. It's seen to be perpetuating a sense that something is missing. And if we think that what's missing are these answers, we'll keep seeking answers to the hardest of questions that humanity hasn't been able to work out yet. And it's going to end up inevitably in frustration unless the person happens to find the answer. But the unfortunate thing is, even if they find the answer, they'll find that wasn't what was needed in order to make life contenting and or feel like it's fulfilled or full of contentment. And we have proof of that, not necessarily finding the answer to the very hard questions, because obviously that hasn't happened yet. But the psychological self has set up all sorts of objectives that it has moved towards in life, thinking that this is what is needed. And sometimes, many times, we get what we want. And what happens is we just kick the can further down the road, and it then becomes about something else, because it wasn't solved by what we thought it would be solved by: the job promotion, or the new partner, or the increase in affluence, financial capability. Those things can make life easier. They can make life more pleasurable. So I'm not invalidating, saying that improvements in circumstance have no value. They have value on another level. They deliver more pleasure, and they can make life less stressful. But they won't quell the internal dissatisfaction, and that's why if it did, then we'd have all the successful people in life would say, well, I'm the most happy in life. Because obviously, if that correlation existed, or if the causation was there, that things give internal peace of mind, then those with the most things would be the most happy. And it's evident that that's not the case. So where does it come from? It comes from a reconnection to the true self, the real self, what we really are beyond the conceptual self. And the psychological me is a conceptual self. It doesn't feel like a conceptual self. It feels concrete. It feels real. But when we start seeing the movements of mind, it becomes very apparent, especially when the specific movements of the psychological self are described, as in guilt and blame, pride, worry, expectation. And when we start to see all the subsets under each of those broad categories, we'll see the movement. So even some expectation, just to dwell on that one, the expectation that my happiness will be found in finding the answer to whether God exists, or whether consciousness is emergent from the brain, or whether it is prior to form. That's an expectation. That means where essentially our happiness is dependent on that. So we're waiting to be happy. We're working towards happiness, to becoming something that has the potential to be happy. So if that becomes part of our working mind, so the working mind is just the functional part of our intellect, where that concept becomes understood first as a pointer, something that we're not particularly familiar with, but we understand it in concept. So it means we have an intellectual understanding of what is being said, and then that intellectual understanding starts being able to see that movement in our own life when it's happening, because it doesn't happen 24/7. And so when it kicks in, we might see it. Oh, there it is again. Here I'm moving towards thinking about, well, what are the things that is going to make my life happy? How can I structure my life so that things become better? And I don't mean functionally better. I mean better in the sense of, we might say, how is it that I'm going to feel happy? And we'll see this movement, the psychological movement of expectation, the expectation that my happiness is to be found in outcomes. So that's one part of how the me. So the me refers to a conceptual sense of self that has been put in place. It doesn't see things clearly, and it is prone to feeling vulnerable and feeling uncomfortable in life. The opposite of fulfilled, content, happy, at peace. Happiness, when I say happiness, happiness through peace of mind. What peace of mind means essentially the absence of the me, the dissolution of the me, the dissolution of this psychological self. So these three terms are interchangeable. The me, the thinking mind, as opposed to the working mind. So the me, the thinking mind, and the psychological self. They are interchangeable terms, all referring to the same thing. The thinking mind is the cognition of guilt, or where we're blaming ourselves for having been a failure in the past, and essentially hating ourselves for the fact that we failed, the fact that we might have hurt someone that we care about, the fact that we did something that led to the end of a situation that we imagined might have been much better than where we find ourselves. So that movement in our mind, that movement of thought, is one of the forms of the thinking mind, which means the me in action, the psychological self. The other category of the me in action, the psychological self, the thinking mind, is blame, where our attitude towards the other is of hatred towards the other for what they did or what they didn't do. And pride is another form of the me, the psychological self, the thinking mind. Pride is our attitude to the things that we did in the past that turned out very well. And it's the counter opposite of guilt. Guilt is our attitude to the things that didn't work out in the past, that we didn't do very well, and we say, oh, I was the doer of that. I could have done it much better. And so it's a self-hate. And pride is a self-love on the same basis, which is unfortunately misguided, that I am in control of the things that didn't go so well, or I should be in control. I have the capacity to have been in control, and I was in control of the things that did really well. And so that becomes, they're layers of this psychological self, this belief in personal doership, sets us up to hate ourselves or to feel pride, like, look what I did, look how good I am. And as we've no doubt heard in various teachings in the Bible, I think pride comes before the fall, which really is saying that if we have this attitude of pride, it's building up the psychological self, and it won't be long before life shows us our fallibility of not being in control, and the proud psychological self is going to feel it's going to be in the most vulnerable position to not be able to deal with a failing. So it will flip from pride into shame. And if not into shame, it'll flip into blaming everything around it for the failing. So you might see that part of the psychological self is this belief in personal doership. It's part of the misunderstanding. So what's the other part of what happens in order for the suffering to come to an end and for there to be a sense of contentment. And the other part is the grounding into the recognition of the self that is not conceptual. And so it's described as absolute. In order for us to, it's a useful pointer, because remember, it's pointing at something that we're blind to, something we don't understand. We've just heard the concept, the true self. And so often it becomes apparent that the person, the seeker listening, hears a concept like the true self or consciousness, but there isn't any first-hand reference to what that word is referring to. And it's not much good running around with a lot of intellectual knowledge of the framework. So it's not much good if someone says, oh, what are you? Oh, I'm a seeker. And what's all this seeking about? And you go, oh, it's about understanding the true self. And then someone will say, well, what's the true self? And oh, it's the absolute. It's consciousness. It's what I am. I've just, we tend to forget it. But really I'm the absolute, or I'm consciousness. I'm not a body-mind organism. You might be able to get the sense that if it's just word knowledge, intellectual knowledge, that is, and the seeker might actually think that they've got it, right? That in giving those answers, being able to answer the questions just with intellectual knowledge, that they understand. And so there's a lot of criticism of in historical texts about scholars. Scholars, they might know what's in each chapter and be able to use all the lingo and be very scholarly about the wisdom teachings. However, that doesn't necessarily translate into a deep knowing of what all those words are pointing at. Now, you can have some sages, some masters very clearly had the deep knowing, and they happen to be quite scholarly and could talk about it with reference to the many texts, and have written many commentaries on the texts in ways that are very educated and scholarly. But what's most important is to have our own direct experience of what is being pointed at. And at the end of the day, I feel very comfortable in saying if all of the concepts are then wiped away from your memory, it wouldn't matter. The concepts are there to help us to point, to keep pointing, so that it can be seen. And then once it's, and what I mean by seen is so that it can be felt, known directly. So a door opens up essentially, and we come to appreciate an aspect of ourself that was hidden. And it's like, for example, as an analogy, and remember all analogies are going to fail somewhere, if you taste the strawberry, you have the taste of the strawberry. So when the door opens up, there is a knowing, experiential knowing of what was pointed at. And the pointings were just helping us overcome the obstacles that have been set in place as part of the psychological self. The psychological self is essentially the veil. So the pointing towards that which is real, that which we really are, is one movement, and the other movement is the diminishing of them. So pointing at the movements of the psychological self, so that gets seen when it's happening. And when we have a taste of both, and we know the movements of the psychological self very well, and we also start having access into the ground of being, what starts to happen is there is a tendency to want to shift out of one into the other. And by that point, we start to appreciate directly, without anyone needing to tell us, what experiential difference there is in life when we find ourselves grounded out of the psychological self and into the ground of being. Relief is one of the best words. Why is it a relief? It's a relief because the shift out of the psychological self into the ground of being it's not really gaining anything. It's rediscovering a dimension of ourself that is much more true, let's say, compared to the psychological movement of the me. And so someone would say, well, you're gaining that which is true. Well, you always were that. It's not gaining something like a gold necklace or a diamond ring or knowledge. You always were that. So you haven't gained the true self. It's just revealed itself. And what's happened is we've lost something. We've lost the movement of the psychological me, of the thinking mind. And that movement of the psychological me is uncomfortable. It's always attacking, defending, feeling attacked, waiting for something, regretting, worrying, anxiety. It's not relaxed, it's not at peace, it's not in harmony. It's not in flow with life. And so that's why it's a relief when it stops and it becomes apparent that there can be a shifting out of it when it's real, when it's seen deeply, that it doesn't serve a purpose. It's a habit that has been put in place because there was the assumption that it served a purpose, part of the misunderstanding of where our happiness will be found. And so, I'm seeing all the hands go up. I might not take questions today. And if I do take questions, let's keep it very much in line with what I'm speaking about in terms of unpicking the different concepts that we're talking about: the me, the thinking mind, consciousness. So there's a relief when we find ourselves shifting out of the thinking mind into being. And being is free of thought. We might realize how habituated we are to thinking. And what I mean by that is how compulsively thinking happens. Because there isn't anyone doing the thinking. There isn't a doer that can help it doing the thinking, but rather thinking happens obsessively. Thinking, when the psychological me is in place, the psychological self is in place, all it knows how to do is think. And a lot of that thinking is complaining, judging, regretting, worrying, expecting, blaming. And it's a whole additional, it's a superfluous movement of thought that really isn't needed, but we've not experienced life with that layer of thought not being there. So that's why it's very important for teachings to keep, because it is unlikely to happen the first time someone hears it. It might sound simple, right? Just it's a shift out of thinking into the ground of being, which is outside of thought. But how does that happen? When it's heard, it sounds like you have to do it. So then what happens is the thinking kicks in and says, okay, so how am I going to do it? Let's see. Okay, I'm going to stop thinking. Okay, 1, 2, now stop thinking. And it doesn't work. So a witnessing needs to develop over time. And the witnessing tends to develop when these aspects are described and start to become understood in the working mind. So the working mind, as opposed to the thinking mind, is part of the intellect that understands concepts and isn't moving with the principles of the me. So then it's not a movement that believes in personal doership. It's not a movement that believes in something in the future that I can get. All of that movement is what would prevent dropping into the ground of being. That's what would prevent witnessing from happening. And that's what's habituated, that movement of the psychological me. So remember, we have the psychological me that believes itself to be something, and it functions that way. It functions according to its structure. And thinking of the sort of getting somewhere and it being in control of making things happen, blaming itself, feeling frustrated when things don't happen, that's all the psychological me. And at first, the seeker hears all the concepts through the lens, the filter of the psychological me. And so then the psychological me just takes the concepts and tries to run with them. And it doesn't deliver peace of mind because it's essentially just strengthening that psychological me. However, if the descriptions do end up setting into the working mind, where the working mind says, I don't have to do anything with this. I'm understanding what the concept is saying, that there is a movement that happens within this body-mind organism, and the movement, it's a movement of thought, what's called the psychological me, and it's guilt, blame, pride, worry, expectation in many different subforms. And then those movements of thought might start to be seen. So you know what that means? That means that now it's starting to become an object. That's all thought is. Thought is objects arising in consciousness. So as soon as we see our own thinking, a degree of separation, like distance, has happened. Prior to that, our thinking was my thinking. It was who I am. That's identification with the psychological self. As soon as thinking, both the working mind and the thinking mind, as soon as that gets seen, something has shifted. The same with feelings and emotions. They arise in the body-mind organism. So thinking happens. Everything is happening. It's automatic. Now, the psychological self doesn't see anything as a happening. It sees it as my doing, your doing. The true self is the witness. The true self doesn't make things happen. It is aware of that which is happening. And it is aware of that which is happening from a perspective and a knowing that it is just happening. It's a different vantage point than when there is awareness from the vantage point of the psychological me. From the vantage point of the psychological me, there's no distance, and we're essentially one with the thinking. And therefore, the thought is who I am. And there's no that's when the separation from the true self is at its strongest, because it means there's full identification with the false self, and the false self is the veil. So the description of thinking happening in a body-mind organism according to the genes and up-to-date conditioning. So the body-mind organism has a faculty that we can call intellect. Now, the intellect has these two sections, the thinking mind and the working mind. The thinking mind is the psychological self. So we hear the word intellect and we think that it's intelligent, right? Intellect just means the capacity to cognize, and it can cognize incorrectly. So the fact that humans have an advanced intellect, a complex intellect, is what Ramesh used to describe as a double-edged sword. A dog has a much less complex intellect. I'm not saying it doesn't have an intellect. It clearly has an intellect, but it has a less complex intellect than the human being, so it can't conceptualize its own existence. It definitely doesn't go into regret and blame and expectation. It just doesn't have that thinking capacity. The human being does, and what has happened is that complex thought has allowed it to go down this slippery slope, and has allowed the psychological self to kick in. Now, on the other hand, the intellect has also allowed, on the working mind side of things, amazing discoveries to be understood. All of the discoveries of the many aspects of life. So we have vast knowledge, and that's been very useful for certain things. So the working mind is the functional thinking, and the thinking mind is the psychological self. And they are happening in not because of, they're not who you are really. They're an aspect of the object in life. The body is the object. The body is, in broad terms, a result of genes and up-to-date conditioning, and the intellect is a subset of the body. Now, consciousness is not the intellect in this definition of consciousness. Consciousness is that which is aware of everything that happens, including the body and the intellect, including the body, the intellect, and the movement of emotions. The body, the intellect, the movement of emotions, and feelings of hunger, tiredness. And all of those movements, including our behaviors, our thoughts, our interactions with others, are happening, not our doing. They're automatic. They're a result of what moves in front of us. They're a result of our development up to this point in time, any point in time. And then we find ourselves in a circumstance that we haven't been in control of. And there's a reaction that happened. Now, that reaction, we tend to, the psychological me says, oh, that was my reaction. I did that. What you are is not the intellect. What you are is not the body, but the true self that has been forgotten is that which is aware of everything that is happening. So these are just descriptions that might enable an objectification of things that we've previously identified as the subject. So if we identify with the body as the subject, with the thoughts as the subject, with the emotions as the subject, what we're really saying is, I am that. And then we are one with objects. So that's a psychological identification with an object. It's what we could call a divine hypnosis. Part of this story of life seems to be a hypnosis where the true self becomes identified with that which it is not. So this witnessing over time, and it requires dedication, not from a doer. It just means if your destiny is to find yourself thinking, not because you make the thoughts happen, but you see thoughts of the framework arising throughout the day. And as a result of the thoughts arising, like thoughts, we could have a thought about the fact that thoughts are just happening in a body-mind organism. That thought might actually lead to a change that we can call the onset of witnessing. And witnessing is essentially this slow disidentification of the self from what are actually just objects. And this consciousness that does the witnessing, it is the witnessing. It's not really that consciousness does witnessing. Consciousness and witnessing is a functioning of consciousness. it's silent. And it's not thought. Because we're so habituated to functioning as the psychological self, if the psychological self tries to do the witnessing, what it will do is do a whole lot of labeling. True witnessing is silent. And it's direct. It's really simple when it starts to happen, and we wonder, why was this so hidden? Or what I'm speaking about here is the very consciousness that is aware of the table and the chairs and the trees. But it's aware of the table and the chairs and the trees from an identified position of the body. So there tends to be a looking at the table from the perspective of another object. So one object that believes it's the subject looking at another object. And consciousness, awareness is functioning through the human object. But until it's realized, whenever we look at the table, the chair from the point of view of the body, we're just going to be reinforcing the identification that doesn't allow witnessing to happen. So for the purpose of what I'm speaking about here, I would suggest that the notion that what is always looking, and this is something you have direct access to, that which is looking, and I'm talking about that which has recognized your life from the moment you were born, that is beyond the body. And that the seeing is not actually happening through the eyes or because of the eyes. And the hearing isn't happening because of the ears. It's happening because of awareness that is bigger than what it is seeing, and it is in fact bigger than and outside of encompassing the body. The body is just an object that fits into that field of awareness. It can be a great relief to find that space, to find the ground from which life is known, and what is known is a movement of source, you could say. And another way we can relate to it is we see everything as a happening. It's never the same, it's never static, it's just a movement of consciousness recognized by consciousness. So everything is arising inside of a field of awareness. And what is arising and moving is in itself consciousness that, from a perception point of view, appears like form, is experienced as form. From the witnessing point of view, where the body is not necessarily partaking in life in the moments when this movement is establishing, the body is essentially sitting quietly. And from the perspective of the witnessing consciousness, it becomes clear that everything is inside it and not separate from it and made of it. It's a sea of consciousness. All there is consciousness. That all of the apparent form are forms of consciousness, not dissimilar to a television screen and all of the pixels are lighting up and changing, creating appearance, and the appearance is never the same at any point in time, unless you pause the movie. Essentially, the pixels are always moving, but there aren't any of those objects are not real objects. From the point of view of witnessing, it becomes apparent that the world of form is not exactly as it seems. This reveals the nature of our essence. Our essence is not form, but that in which all form arises, that which is aware of the universe, the manifestation, which really means your life in this moment. There's two aspects to this consciousness. So if we use the word consciousness as the umbrella term, the two aspects that are most available for us to become aware of in practice is the function of awareness, or the aspect of awareness, and the aspect of being, which is the sense of I am, I exist. Not a thought. It's non-conceptual. So both awareness and existence are not concepts. They are known when witnessing is happening. With the witnessing, which is a movement of consciousness, when witnessing is happening, consciousness can become aware of itself, and it becomes aware of itself by essentially becoming aware of its two aspects. Because if we're looking for consciousness, we might have more trouble than if we are pointed at awareness, which is one of the aspects of consciousness, and the undeniable sense of existence. That's one of the traits of a human being and its complexity, is that when consciousness is functioning in conjunction with the body-mind organism, it is able to become aware of itself. And it's a bit ironic because it becomes aware of itself when the body-mind organism is seen to just be an object. So it seems like there is a disidentification. So on the one hand, it seems like consciousness being aware of itself has nothing to do with the body-mind organism. In fact, it has to do with no longer seeing itself as the subject, no longer seeing the body-mind organism as the subject. So I'll just recap and then I'll take some questions. The key components that I've been speaking about today are the intellect, which is a subset of the body-mind organism, related to the brain, which is part of the body. The intellect has two subsets, the working mind and the thinking mind. The working mind is hopefully where the concepts that I've been speaking about land and get stored, and those concepts can arise automatically throughout the course of the next days, weeks. And that's just information. The working mind understands how to work out how much money to take on a holiday, works out when to call a taxi to catch the plane on time, knows what groceries to buy, understands how to plant things or fix things. And it's not regretting, expecting, blaming. It's not the movement of the psychological self. That is the thinking mind. So we've got the intellect, and the intellect functions as either the working mind or the thinking mind. The thinking mind is synonymous with the me, and the psychological self, which is the false self that acts as the veil of the true self. Now, I mentioned the body-mind is, I guess, the big biological system. So the intellect, in the big biological system of the body-mind, the human body-mind, there is the brain, and the brain is where the intellect is linked to the brain. Then we have other movements of the body-mind, moving our hands, being able to function, drive a car. Now that's not necessary. There can be an interplay between the intellect and the body-mind. So we learn how to tie our shoelaces, how to wash ourselves, how to use a knife and fork, and then that plays out. So all of this is automatic. When I say we learn, essentially the body-mind organism is conditioned by life. And those movements happen automatically. Even the thinking that seems like my thinking is just happening. And from the witnessing point of view, that becomes apparent. From the witnessing point of view, the subject doesn't do any thinking. It witnesses thinking happening. And it can be hilarious, it can be the source of great laughter to see thinking that I always believed was my thinking, that I was doing. It becomes very apparent when the ground of self, the subject, moves out to a position where it sees the automatic functioning of the brain, which is a biological system. Why wouldn't it function on its own? It's sort of like your car that operates on its own, that the engine turns over without you needing to do the turning over of the engine, because it's designed to be self-perpetuating. And you can watch the engine moving. And if at some point you thought you were the engine, or you thought you were doing the engine, it would become very, it'd be quite humorous for you to then realize that you are not the engine. You never were the engine. And the engine was always, I'm talking about a car engine here, was always operating on its own. And you are that which is aware of that which was always functioning on its own. And the same can be appreciated for our thinking and for our emotions and our behaviors and our actions. They're all happening as part of the play of life. We could say according to God's will, according to source. All right, well, maybe some more of that. Oh, just a reminder that there is a retreat happening in 1st of September, I think it is, a 3 or a 6-day retreat, whichever you want to, and that's in Slovenia, in Maribor. So the information is on the website. Ranko, hi.
Hi, Roger. How are you?
Yes, I'm well, thank you. And you?
Okay, also very well. Just one brief question, which is kind of my blind spot. I've heard explanations many times, but still doesn't sink in. So in the top-down teachings, there is a concept that we have to break down our identification with the body, with the mind, with the rest of these external things in order to be able to see the aspect of ourselves that we tend to forget or overlook or whatever, which is consciousness, source, good aspect, and so on. And on the other hand, I heard Ramesh was talking about an ego and describing it as consciousness identified with three-dimensional entity, which we call body, and this identification with name and form, basically. And there are two types of ego, you know the story. And from Ramesh's description of the ego, it seems like actually identification with the body and mind re-emerge again in this bottom-up approach. And so my question is, how this sense of separation really dissolved? Because ego, even without sense of doership, still looks to me as some sort of a separate entity. Maybe I'm mixing identification and attachment. I don't know. I'm not sure.
No, you're not. It's I'm very glad you asked the question because, and this is the sort of question I wanted here because it goes into further unpicking the nuance of the teaching. So let me just reframe what you have put forward for those others listening. So in what I've been speaking about today and what you will hear in other top-down teachings is a set of descriptions that talk about a disidentification from the body, a disidentification from the thoughts, a disidentification from the world of form, essentially. And I'll explain firstly why that happens or why that is needed, why it's very important, because that is one of the approaches that can bring about a radical appreciation of an aspect of ourself that had been forgotten, had been overlooked. In fact, it's the most effective way of realizing when we hear what, to someone who is not a seeker, is very radical and in fact sounds fantastical and even, unrealistic. For some seekers, there is a ripeness, a readiness to be moved onto that new platform. And it's a very important part of peace of mind setting in. Because if we don't have access to that part of ourselves and we just hear the teachings of from the bottom-up point of view, which I often spend a lot of time talking about, and that means that the human being, the body, the person, which includes the body mind, is always looking at everything that's happening from the point of view of personal doership. Now, those are also accurate statements. They're two sets of accurate statements coming from different ends to help us meet at the middle, right? And dissolve the thinking mind movements, and at the same time allow a realization of the true self aspect. So without finding ourselves connected to the witnessing, where we can just be silent, like where silence happens, where the witnessing doesn't need more than to just witness. And witness is awareness. The functioning of awareness is silent. Without that, there's always going to be a piece missing. The process tends to be gradual, right? And it tends to be work on this section, this aspect, and then a bit of work on this aspect. And so that's why there are teachings that, excuse me, teachings that focus on the top down, and then other teachings bottom up. Because we'll find ourselves resonating with different ones at different times. So in the top-down teachings, there won't be any reference to the body-mind as what we are. What you're pointing out is that Ramesh, when he describes things from the bottom up, will say that consciousness has identified with a body-mind organism. And that identification remains even after enlightenment. Now, because of the use of the word identification and how it can be used differently, it can be confusing. So I've used the word identification in today's talk as being getting lost. Re-identifying yourself with something you're not. When Ramesh uses the word identification, he essentially says, what is the human being? The human being is the impersonal consciousness of Source, the impersonal consciousness of God, identified with a particular body-mind organism. So I changed the word a little bit, or I changed the word to linked to a body-mind organism to avoid the confusion. I'm not convinced that rewording it is better, because I have a great respect for the framework as Ramesh put it forward, but nonetheless, I've changed it to impersonal consciousness of Source linked to a body-mind organism. That's what Ramesh means when he says identified with a body-mind organism. And what he's saying is that even after the deep realization that what we are, in essence, is the consciousness of God that is functioning through all of the human beings, even after that realization, until death happens, until physical death of the body happens, consciousness of Source will always be identified with that body. It's how that body functions, how that person functions in life. So he'd say that take Ramana or Jesus or any sage, and after enlightenment, they will still answer to their name. If impersonal consciousness wasn't identified with the body after enlightenment, what it would mean is that when someone called the name, the consciousness wouldn't know itself as anything to do with that name or form. and so it wouldn't respond. But what he's saying is that even in the case of a sage, consciousness continues to function through that body-mind organism, which means, from his point of view, it continues to be linked or identified with the body-mind. Now, that's different to attachment. It's different to psychological involvement, because what happens after the process has looked after all of the phases and then brought in an integration, there is a deep understanding of what's happening, a deep understanding of that in order to have this experience of life, consciousness has to essentially function through a vehicle. And with the realization of enlightenment, there isn't the covering up of the essence. There is a continuous, unbroken realization that what is animating the body is consciousness of source, and that's what we really are. But still, the body-mind organism will continue to function as, Ramesh or Buddha. And so that identification doesn't mean the forms of ignorance. So also it means, what does it feel like? Because it can be very misleading, and that is if we're told that the separation has fallen away, we might think that that means experientially the separation has fallen away. And so we might then have this question, does it mean that we're going to feel one? Or that's the assumption. The assumption is because, remember, often we talk about how it has to be known experientially, not intellectually. And so then when we talk about the end of separation, the assumption is, we're going to have an experiential feeling of the end of separation. Now, there are those peak experiences. They do happen where there is an experiential sense of oneness. And to some extent, whenever witnessing is happening in a very pronounced way, there is also a sense of oneness in the witnessing. However, as the integration happens, because this realization phase, this witnessing phase, or rather the awakening phase, it's a phase. It's not the end. It's what then develops into the end product. Let's call it that. But it's in itself, it's just a preparatory phase. It's a very important realization, but at some point there is an integration that happens, and that integration means that the experience can be once again of living as a human being, where there isn't a great sense of being the tree as well as the person. So we have a sense of being different from the tree, different from the chairs, separate from them. The experience is separate from them, but the knowing that happened through all of those other phases means that we're not confused, we're not fooled by how the experience feels. It no longer covers up our true essence as consciousness. Whereas previously, the sense of the experience of being separate from the table and the tree, without all of the preparatory shifts that happen, created a sense of ignorance, a sense of misidentification with who we are as the subject. And so then the integration means we get to come and live as the human being. We then will say, well, we'll reincorporate the intellect and the body and the emotions and the consciousness into one whole, the person, with a clarity on the consciousness that simply wasn't there before. And not only a clarity on the consciousness, but a new way of the thinking functioning, whereby the thinking mind no longer functions. And it doesn't function, one, because it's been seen to be unhelpful and based on misunderstanding, but also because we find ourselves resting in what we can call our true self, and it becomes very apparent that outcomes are just part of life. Life is always outcomes. And from that place of knowing ourselves, outcomes are not so important. They're pleasure or they're pain, but they are not where we find our satisfaction and our contentment from. And so that combination means that the thinking mind dissolves, and we then find ourselves as a human being again in an integrated sense, but without the previous uncomfortableness that used to be there.
Yeah, it's like an example from the last satsang, like sun rising and sun falling. We practically see this is the truth. Sun is falling, sun is rising. But on the other hand, we see that Earth is round, sun is not moving, and this is part of integration.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, I understand. That was the problem. Seeing that this is not experience, actually. This is the other part. Like more theoretical, but at the same time also valid.
Yeah. There is what makes it complicated, a little complicating, is that as for a lot of, well, I don't know if it's a lot of people, depends on what the top-down teaching was, is that there will be an experiential shift into not being the person. And it will feel like, oh, I am not the person at all. I am not the body. And in fact, that's very important. It's true from one perspective. And in that phase, experientially, we will feel like we are formless awareness. There will be a sense of oneness and a sense that we are not the person. And so you often hear people talking from that phase. The thing is, with most processes that are phased, whenever we're in a phase, it feels like this is it until the phase changes. And then we have the benefit of saying, oh, that wasn't it. So a lot of people in non-dual seeking are speaking from that place. And that's when the integration part is not brought into the picture. I think there's probably good reason that it happens that way, because as I said, a lot of very impressive shifts happen when we're exposed to those teachings. And so it can actually serve a purpose. But at some point, we do really need to get pulled back down onto the next part of the process, where we start to live as a human being again and integrate all of the aspects back into who we are.
Yeah, that explains that. Well, thank you for the answer, and probably we'll see you in Maribor.
Very good. I look forward to it. Thanks, Ranko. Hi, Tejas.
Hey Roger, how's it going?
Very good. And you?
Yeah, good. So my question is kind of twofold. I'll start with the first part. So kind of like the phase that I'm in is that I know who I am, I know what I am, I know that I'm open, but that also I'm Tejas too. But when you were speaking about like the thinking mind and how, yeah, it's kind of funny to kind of watch it go, there's certain kind of movements which it's weird because I feel like a bit of a tension where the thinking mind will kind of be saying some kind of stupid stuff like, oh, you got to make, more money and stuff, or, you got to do this, you got to do this, or, oh, you're single, you need to get in a relationship and like, blah, blah, blah. But when I look, I'm like, well, I'm completely fine. Like I'm complete already. Like I don't need any of that stuff. It could be nice, but I'm fine. But then there's kind of like a pull where the thinking mind will want to kind of bring me another way. And my question is, in terms of like practically addressing that, is kind of the way to kind of get past that, okay, just keep on just recognizing what I am. And then also like, is that just going to take like in a practical sense, like time for that to go away, for that to diminish? And then like for someone like you, like someone like at like your like level, do you have those kinds of movements still where like your mind will be saying stupid stuff? Do you just ignore it, or like do you even have that stuff still come up?
I think to address the question first, let me just say that some thinking about, let's say, money or relationship is fine, and it might not be the thinking mind. It could be the working mind. It depends on where it spirals. So, you might look at your finances, for example, and say, the fact is I really am on the edge of being able to meet my expenses each month, and it creates a bit of stress. And it might be better for me to get a second job if I can. So this is just looking at the facts as it is, considering your options, and you think, oh, well, if I get an extra 10-hour a week job, that would give me a good bit of buffer. So there's no problem with doing that thinking. That's functional thinking, as long as the attitude is, well, maybe that's not going to happen. So we think about it, but then there's a surrender to, well, but it's going to unfold how it's going to unfold. The fact we've been thinking about it, we might see will then play into how it unfolds. We might, I don't know, go and register with a employment agency, or go and have a look on some online websites, or drop into the local shops and ask if they need some help or whatever. And then that movement, if it happens, is seen as, what is happening, just a happening. And so that thinking doesn't have to be the thinking mind, it can be the working mind. However, if it is the thinking mind and not only the working mind, that's it. It will just keep playing over and over. It will also create a sense of, especially if it's something like with a relationship, a sense of it almost being problematic that there isn't a relationship. So if it spirals into essentially attachment to it happening, and if it's not happening, then it starts to just continue to create uncomfortableness, then it's the thinking mind. There is as part of the movement, what happens is the thinking mind will carry on because it's deeply habituated to move in that direction and to assume that it needs things. And then if it sees it doesn't have those things, it'll feel like it's done something wrong, or it is unfortunate, and all of the thinking mind. And then at some point, there'll be a witnessing of that. So the habit hasn't died down completely. It hasn't dissolved, but there isn't an involvement in it. So there is a degree of freedom from it, where it's just witnessed as, and the analogy that's used is the fan has been unplugged, but it still has a certain momentum, and so the the fan blades continue to turn, but it's no longer being powered by a continuous feedback loop. The witnessing is essentially means that the buying into that story, which was the continuous powering of the fan, has stopped. And eventually, when the habit has sort of worn out, so in Advaita, it's those are called the samskaras. When the samskaras have burnt away, then that movement of thought will just stop happening altogether.
Okay, that actually, you actually touched on the second part of the question, on the distinction between the thinking mind and the working mind, because it seems like it can be difficult to tell which is which sometimes. And kind of the example that I wanted to use from kind of what you were speaking about has to do with when you said at a certain point there's not a kind of almost another person that's coming in and, let's say, judging an act and saying, okay, you shouldn't have done this, you were feeling guilty about doing this. But it seems like couldn't that maybe be the working mind in some cases? Because it seems like with some of these cases, at least like from my understanding, like with some of these like gurus that have, like, there've been many cases of this, like they've like acted some of them, pretty terribly towards their students, like, I don't know, like sexually assaulted their students or whatever. And then from what I've read, like some of them after will just be like, well, like, I don't feel bad about it. Like that's what happened. Like, that's just like what is. And that's just like a certain movement or whatever. It's gone. I'm not going to judge myself for it. It seems like in those cases that it would be good to have like another judge coming in, or just like, I don't know, maybe I have the ego come in and just be like, hey, or like, you shouldn't have done that. You shouldn't treat other people this way. And that maybe that could be the working mind. I'm not exactly sure though. I'd like to hear your thoughts on it though.
Yeah, so the end of guilt doesn't mean the end of discernment. It just means the end of judgment. So if we bring in this distinction between discernment and judgment, and once again, if you listen to someone else use the word judgment, like I think actually Spinoza, given that I've mentioned him before, he uses the word judgment as discernment. So that means understanding stuff. In this context, I'm using discernment and judgment as two separate things. So discernment is to realize, oh, that action hurt someone. It wasn't my intention to hurt them, maybe you could say. It wasn't my intention to hurt them, but I see that it hurt them. And so then we learn from that. That can happen independent of shame. And if a sage doesn't feel shame, but the movement prevents them from learning, then that's a bypassing, and it's not the wisdom that is being spoken about here. So I would say that in the case of a sage that understands, the fact that they might describe the absence of guilt doesn't mean the absence of having learned something that becomes essentially part of your up-to-date conditioning. And given a similar situation in the future, the action may be different. It may not. It may still follow the same pattern. And then the sage will say, obviously, I didn't learn deeply enough the first time because it happened a second time. And we can understand, we understand how learning doesn't necessarily overcome certain movements if they're more deeply ingrained than the learning. So either could happen. The point is that not feeling guilt, which really means to understand that, yes, this is how it happened. Yes, it wasn't great. This person was hurt. It wasn't my intention to hurt, but really no one was doing anything, which is not an excuse, right? It's not going to prevent you from being put in prison. The judge doesn't care whether you are the doer or not. So it's not going to, this is not an abdication of responsibility to society. Society will still hold you responsible. But guilt doesn't serve any purpose. We could, if we think that the only way we can learn is to feel guilty, then we would say, yes, you should feel guilty. It's very good for you to feel guilty because you'll learn. But if we can see that learning can happen in the absence of guilt, then ideally that's what happens. And I think that is what happens for a sage, because inevitably everyone's learning from experience.
Okay, yeah, that was all great. Yeah, thank you, Roger, and thank you for holding these meetings. They've been incredibly valuable to me, and I'm sure to others too.
You're welcome. Thanks, Tejas. Hi, Tom.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. I wanted to just touch on, I had a question really on the idea of, I've been sort of thinking about this a lot, the idea of separateness and oneness. And I think initially my understanding was that, let's say post-enlightenment, your actual sense perceptions would be different. So that if I was looking at a tree, for instance, I would see God in the tree. However, and I think the framework was really sort of things from the psychedelic era, let's say, there would be magical things, magical perceptions happening, that sort of thing. So I think what I've come to more recently is that the understanding would be more, not necessarily that the perception itself would change. Like I would still see the tree as a tree, but my understanding or the understanding and awareness would be different. And I haven't quite, gotten to the point where I can fully, integrate the idea of oneness, in all objects, especially within inanimate objects. I think it's easier for me with, animals and so forth than sentient kind of beings. It's more difficult for me for, like, let's say a table and a chair kind of thing. Although I can recognize the intelligence that went into creating that object. But let's say a rock, for instance, that's the one where, like, maybe I would have difficulty with. So I was just wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so the knowing or the understanding that you referred to, so yes, the sense perception largely remains the same. There is definitely the capacity to drop into a more transcendent witnessing while in daily living, but usually when you're doing something that's quite habitual, so maybe walking in the forest, you could drop into a sense of witnessing, or if you're sitting drinking a cup of tea, you could drop into witnessing, or even waiting for a bus and watch all the cars. There is this capacity to shift into a sort of transcendent perspective. And in those moments, there is an experiential shift in how the perception feels. It does feel much more like oneness, but that's not the benefit of enlightenment. That's just a flexibility that comes into the system. the benefit is the end of the suffering. Now, that tends to come in because of the flexibility that has, the shift that has happened that then leads to that flexibility. But in the moments when the witnessing isn't happening, there's no reason why we can't be at peace and content, because what remains is the deep understanding, the deep knowing. Now, that deep knowing isn't an intellectual knowing. It comes as a result of the process that is revealed through many insights, let's say. And you could look at it with a culminating peak experience of oneness. For some people, that's the culmination of the knowing comes with an experiential glimpse of oneness that leaves you changed. What it means is it leaves you changed. It embeds in the system a seeing that you could say can't be unseen. And then the experiential oneness can fade away, and it doesn't matter that it's faded away. You're then left with the deep knowing that that is not separate from an understanding of your true essence, and now understanding, seeing, in a way, seeing the world differently, even though the perception is not on the perception level. Once we shift out of the oneness experience, perception is the same, but there's something else running in the background that is informing us what's happening beyond how it is perceived on the surface. So I guess in simple terms, previously we just saw what was on the surface. Now we see what's on the surface with an understanding, a bigger understanding of what's really happening.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thanks, Tom. Harleen, hi.
Hey, Roger.
Hi there. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. How are you and Daniela doing?
Yeah, very well, thank you. Yeah, we're ready to fly out this week on a trip to Europe.
Yeah, that's nice to hear. I think I've mentioned to you before at the live-in retreat about the body movements that I have, where my back and my shoulders, they get contracted, and then it gets hard to sleep. But then I'm doing everything that I can. Every morning I'm either doing my yoga or my Pilates. That's quite a lot of work that I have to put in to get a good night's sleep. And but when I was at your retreat, none of this happened. Like, I was totally relaxed. But clearly 21 days hasn't done the job. Yeah. Do you have anything to say on this?
Well, it's not unusual for it to take a long time for the various layers to fall away. And the reason is that there are many layers, and the layers tend to get addressed, one at a time, not necessarily literally one at a time, but it is a wearing down of the false beliefs. And as new insights come in, that undermines more and more of the structure. So it's a gradual process. and the misunderstanding, the false sense of self that is really in opposition with the flow of life, that can lead to these contractions, because when the psychological self isn't relaxed, it feels attacked by life. A lot of the time it feels vulnerable, it feels afraid, it's defending itself, it's trying to get somewhere, it's trying to make its way in a world that is inherently difficult for something that is trying to control the uncontrollable. So it leads to these contractions and pain. So if you can see that often that these physical ailments are linked to misunderstanding, you might start to find some movements, some techniques, let's say, but they're not really techniques, they're just things that you've realized work, that can relieve the pain. And one such thing that I am pointing at, I guess, is if the pain can get to a intensity or a feeling where you can connect to the pain and then allow some movement of sound, of voice that describes, or emotion that allows the pain to transmute into a different form, without forcing it, because you can't force it. It needs to be a sort of a connecting the pain to a different form of expression. If that happens, then it can prove to be a very effective way of dumping these energies, which really means, in part, the belief systems out of the system. So try that. I mean, when I say try it, just keep it in mind. Don't try to make it happen, because that would be the wrong. That wouldn't be helpful.
Like something what you had suggested at the live-in retreat, like to go out and scream it out at the tree, imagining the person, that sort of thing.
Yeah. So
but,
a pillow
yeah, but
works
that,
well.
I'm sorry, at that,
Scream it
yeah,
into
that
a pillow.
Point, yeah. Yeah. At that point in time, there was a person, but right now, life, with God's grace, it's good. No complaints. Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of these things are old. They're not necessarily of today. And so you don't know what it's about, really. And so it might just be sound of pain, of sadness, let's say. And you might not link it to anything happening in your life. It's very strange. Sometimes it reveals itself as being something related to something you have no experience of, what we might call, a past life experience. I don't know if it comes from a past life, but it presents as if it was from some other life sometimes. So, yeah, see what comes up.
Yeah.
Thanks, Arlene. And just quickly, I saw your hand go up, Jaroslaw. I'll say hi to you. How are you?
How are you, Roger? Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah,
I can. Yeah.
I'm glad to connect with you after some break, some time of not being like live, your person. Yeah, so I'm grateful that you started to do again this meeting. It's very nice to see the gathering and to be in front of this teaching again. Yeah. So I would like just like deepen in this understanding, and I have like a question for you. Is this conscious like the this is this has like structure and some like a structure and a moral grain, like, or yeah, just this.
Does the consciousness have structure, did you say?
Stuck and especially moral like seed or yeah, some, yeah, that's the
Well, so it's very easy to talk about consciousness between two people. We're talking about consciousness and completely miss, like turn it into an intellectual notion, right? And it's right here. So when we're talking about it, at some point, it's like, okay, but you have to experience it. And so what is being pointed at is the consciousness that is functioning through you. It can shift in its, we've always experienced consciousness functioning through the body. It's what allows us to be aware, but we don't focus on the fact consciousness is happening. That's one of the things that the pointings are trying to get us to see, that consciousness is happening through our body, mind, organism. We are conscious human beings. And first we become conscious of the consciousness of the human being, and then it might shift into a consciousness that it transcends the body, and the body is witnessed by that consciousness. But essentially, if it does shift from being the consciousness functioning through the body that we all have, we've always had, if it does shift to being a more transcendental consciousness, it's the same consciousness that shifts. So one way or the other, we need to look for it, starting with the body consciousness.
Yeah, I'm like, when I'm, especially now with you, I'm like, this body was in touch with this like ocean of resting, and it's very liberating. Yeah, but like the curiousness is like from the body of this Jerek, is this like God wave, like beings ocean, is this has like, this is like unknown of what the like the majesty wants to like create, like this is just happening, but this just happening has like no like plan, like this is like who like this is like, because from the small body, like this body, it's like a little bit of humility and trust to put your will or your control away, and just and you yes, and so just like, yeah, that maybe from the some, if just again some child part wants to know about more about what's the God plans or something like that, and yeah. So.
Yes, that's what I would say. Who wants to know? Because the point is to rest in consciousness. It doesn't give us answers, but we don't need answers. It doesn't give us answers of where it comes from, or but what it gives us, it's self-confirming that it's here, that there is awareness. It's what we can know ourselves as. So when you have that rest, like you said, just gently resting in being, that's it, and we want to just remain there. And then you're exactly right. The question that comes up, oh, where does this come from? And what is it controlling? Or any of these questions, they actually cut off the connection to it. And we need to find a place of being satisfied with no answers. And truly, the moving into that ground of being, if we feel a relief, we realize, this is such a relief to just rest here as witnessing awareness. And I don't have answers, but it's still a relief. And then the thinking mind comes in and says, oh, but surely you need to know these questions.
Yeah, yes. So the truth is, I don't need to know that is this has structure, or is this moral, or is this has that or that. Yeah.
Just be it. And in being it, then any answers that are meant to come will come.
Thank you, Rita.
Mm-hmm. You're welcome. Nice to see you, Jaroslav. Thank you, everybody.